Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society, and tonight I'm making some black beans, rice, and putting in a few sausage bits and pieces. And I wanted to do that and talk with you a bit about it because this is a very common dish for people in Cuba, beans and rice. And there's an excellent article by a fellow named Patrick Sims that was in Harper's in, I think it was in 2010. But it's also on his website. Symmes is his name. And he's a journalist, and he wanted to go to Cuba and live for a month as a Cuban. So he gave himself a budget of, at the time, I think it was 15 American dollars, thinking that that would be enough to get by on food there. Now, food is rationed there. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that Cubans have a carbon footprint of about 2 tons carbon dioxide equivalent per capita. And if you've seen any of the lockdown videos that I've done, or 15-minute city videos, I've talked about the fact that there's a very strange and interesting document that was published in 2016 called Deadline 2020. And in that document, it was meant for the C40 cities of the world. In that document, they proposed that by 2030, people living in cities should have a carbon footprint of 2.9 tons carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's about what Cubans scrape by on. And they live in a fairly warm climate compared to us. So I've prepared kind of ready-made black bean sauce here, and a little bit of turnip and some onion and garlic. So that's way more than Patrick Sims had in his time there. I'm not going to tell you all of the story because everyone should read it. It's fascinating. He got there thinking that people got a fairly significant sum of food as ration every month, only to find out that for his $15, first of all, he could not, as an American citizen, buy food that was rationed. And secondly, because he needed to have a ration card, I think it's called a libretto. And also that people got much less rations than he originally thought they did. So he met some very helpful Cubans who helped him figure it out. And really the story is one of the fact that people do get by on almost nothing, but only because they have some side interest, meaning, you know, sort of some black market way of either getting a bit more food or making a bit more money. He described himself as a fairly big man, and I think he lost something like 30 pounds in a month. And why? Because he basically was living in a 15-minute city kind of context. He didn't have enough money to take the bus, so he had to walk everywhere. And he really lived on the sparsest amount of food that was possible. And really only the good graces of his friends that he met there kept him alive. And the only thing that he had in abundance really was sugar. And at one point it drove him so much to despair living this way that he actually made his own moonshine with sugar. So, I mean, I'm lucky. I have here some brown rice. It takes longer to cook, but it's you know, quite a bit more filling, quite a bit more nutritious, lasts a lot longer than just white rice. He said they had a very cheap variety of rice at the time. And of course, as I said, I have sausage. In fact, there's a very painful scene in his story where he's so hungry one day. He's walking along, and sometimes I guess people have, or had at that time, they have a little business run out of their house. So maybe they make little tarts or little pizzas or something. Anyway, this one lady was selling little pizzas, and he was just desperate for sort of North American food. And they also offered it with a bit of chorizo sausage on it. And he was really like getting down to his last pennies. But he couldn't resist, so he bought it. And you have to read this part of the story, how difficult life is, emotionally and physically, how gut-wrenching it is to be hungry. Now, again, the reason I bring this up is that in the climate community, they're now pushing for rationing to stop climate change. So I've already told you about Deadline 2020. This was the project that was done by a consulting firm called ARUP, A-R-U-P, back in 2016. And that's where this idea of giving or commanding everyone to have a 2.9 ton CO2 equivalent carbon footprint. But now, many more academics are really moving into this area, rationing and climate change mitigation. And of course, they love to use World War II analogies. And in this document, this is actually under ethics, policy, and environment. But they're talking about how rationing is probably a more fair way, because that's what people thought in World War II in Britain, that it was more fair that rationing was going on because everyone was rationed equally. And it says here, as long as people believe that all classes and sections are suffering and enduring equally, they will put up with very great hardship. It is unfairness that people resent. So that's from a report in May 1941 in the Ministry of Education. So again, here they're talking that this is a debate about values. If you recall, Mark Carney wrote a book called Values just before the world started falling apart. So I doubt that he will ever be rationed, fair as it might be. You see, they also say here that there's a scarcity of carbon sinks. Well, not in Canada. We live in the second most forested country in the world. And it says here, given this scarcity and the planet's limited ability to absorb GHG emission, we simply cannot use all the resources we have. We cannot burn our existing fossil fuel reserves if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change. More generally, consider the evidence that no country meets the basic needs of its citizens at a globally sustainable level. So it sounds like they want to ration everybody in the world equally, and so I guess we'll be living like Cubans on what I call the Cuban diet that Patrick Sims wrote about. You see, and then they mention here carbon tax. It's important to acknowledge that when we compare rationing with, for example, a carbon tax in this context, it's not rationing alone that's being compared to a carbon tax. Rather, the more appropriate comparison is between a carbon tax on the one hand and rationing plus some package of regulations or restrictions on the other hand. There are a few things we can say here. Rationing in this context may require a public information campaign to help people recognize the scarcity of carbon sinks. So, these academics are living in a completely different world than you and I. They think it would be fabulous to have personal carbon allowances, and as you may have seen in some of our earlier videos, the Vaxport is apparently primed to put personal carbon allowances or rations right on your Vaxport. And So that's, and associate that, of course, with a digital ID. So, you know, things they're looking at are, in Britain, 2 items that were rationed were petrol and food. That's gasoline and food. And clothing was rationed. And aviation could be rationed. And carbon-intensive farming methods and factory farm livestock could be banned, which would clearly have impacts on food supplies. Yes, I wouldn't be able to put sausage in my little beans and rice, would I? No. I'd have to have crickets. And I have some right over here, you know, but I'm telling you that, oh, I think they're all dead. Well, I guess if they're dead, it doesn't matter. People probably will have to crunch them up and put them on their ice cream or something. You know, I just don't think that I'd prefer crickets over black beans and sausage with a little simple coleslaw salad on the side. You know, this isn't a very expensive meal. It's fairly easy to make, and I don't think I want to highlight the underappreciated virtues and the specific egalitarian nature of rationing. I do not want that. I want the world to operate in a way where people can access food without some elite green climate-obsessed academics deciding what I can and can't eat and in what quantity. So there's your heads up, and that's another episode of Gasthma, Cooking the Climate. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.